I just wanted to say something that is kind of relevant to what you're doing, Ruben, because I don't really know exactly how what you're doing. I did say something about this predictive model. The mind kind of predicts, I guess, whatever the future or whatever in a certain way. Yeah. So are you able to explain a little bit about that, how it relates to
Sure.
Dhamma or whatever? I'd be interested to hear that. Yeah.
Yeah, so what's often called predictive processing has many different names, actually. Predictive processing, active inference, or the free energy principle, as framed by Professor Carl Friston. And this is, perhaps for the first time, a kind of grand unifying theory of how the mind, brain, and even consciousness comes about. We haven't had one of these really yet, at least not one that's been reasonably well accepted in the community, but predictive processing has a lot of support and a reasonable evidence base as well. The basic tenets of the theory are that what we perceive out there in the world is not something that's received through the senses and then gradually built up and constructed as it was kind of imagined previously. Instead, the idea is that the brain is actively predicting the world. And this is because the brain doesn't have direct access to the world. The brain is the machine that allows us to make representations, build models, build concepts, to understand reality, to understand that the cup is separate from the table, and so on. But the brain doesn't have direct access. It only has this noisy sensory stream of really electrical data to go on. And from this electrical data, what it does is it constructs a predictive model of each moment and also future moments and past moments. And so it does this constantly. So the difference here is that it's not trying to simply take in the data, it's actually kind of constructing, generating this model of the world, ourself and the past and the future. And then, and this is the important part, because what makes it computationally efficient is that the brain only then updates its model when there's errors, when there's surprises, when it gets something wrong. So if you think about when you've seen something out of the corner of your eye and you think it's, maybe something scurrying in the bush and you think it's a snake, and then you look and, oh, it's just a lizard, right? The model updates because you've constructed something, there's an error, you fixate, you get more data, and now you get new information.
Like when I mistook a kangaroo tail for a snake.
There you go. Exactly. And so the brain has this extraordinarily complex problem of taking in all of this sensory data that comes in at different times. The visual data comes in at a different speed than the auditory data and the interoceptive data out of the body. Meanwhile, they're also arriving in the brain in different areas. Yeah. So they're coming in at different speeds, arriving in different areas, and somehow we need to compute this stable, coherent, consistent model over time, and making it predictive is kind of one way to solve this problem. So that's a very big picture, and lots of details missing from that. But
yeah. Okay, and how does that relate to meditation?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And of course, this is where I've been working, is in the neuroscience of meditation. And in 2021, we published an article basically trying to understand some of the path of meditation from the lens of predictive processing. One of the reasons that I found predictive processing so interesting is because as a long-term meditator myself, it was the first time that I was introduced to a model of the mind that actually helped make sense of my contemplative experience and actually could integrate it. Previously, I found cognitive neuroscientific models extremely unsatisfying and very kind of niche, particularly because they just didn't account for the deeper experiences that can happen in meditation, whereas I think the predictive processing model gets us a little bit of the way there. So one of the things that come out of this model, just to give you a very big picture of it, is that as you bring the mind closer into the present moment, actually what naturally happens is that you deconstruct the predictive hierarchy. So this model of reality is built up in layers, from the raw sensory data to our concepts about the data, to our stories about the data, to all of our memories and projections of the past and future. Now, when you bring the mind into the present, and we know that from just straight from the neuroscience, so that's not coming out of any dharma. But what we also know is that this is built in time. So you have to have this rapid construction of predictive models in this hierarchy in order to have the whole model all the way from raw data to abstract thinking and narratives and so on. So as you come into deeper and deeper into the present moment, logically what you're doing is deconstructing this predictive abstraction hierarchy. And so one of the unifying factors, of course, meditation is that you come into the present moment. And so then what we do, you can categorize this further. So you have at the top of this predictive hierarchy, and we can follow this in the brain from the sensory cortices to the default mode network. At the top, we have this narrative self. We have these stories about ourselves spread across time, right? And this is something fairly unique to humans. Then when we start meditation, we come closer to the sensory data. We come to the body, the embodied self, we might call that. So you've got the narrative self, all the stories. You come to the embodied self, which is a little bit lower in the predictive hierarchy. Then, of course, we go deeper. And as we go deeper, if we think about, for example, the jhanas, then we start to be in the domain of more like the witnessing self or the pure presence, the self without a self to some degree, right? And so you start to go close, down. The constructions get more and more simple and more still. And then in this model, you can go also much further to awareness. So now you've deconstructed even the dualities between self and other and subject object and the kind of underlying kind of base constructions that allow us to interpret reality. And then, of course, we can also go further all the way to Nirodha, where the whole predictive model shuts off, with perhaps very interesting consequences on how that model then re-emerges.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. One of the things I was thinking about when I saw some of the videos that you did, and and you kind of talk about the various levels of meditation, talk about your own meditation practices and cessation and all of these kind of things. And it occurs to me straight away that some of the ways you describe these things don't necessarily agree with how we would describe some of these meditation experiences. And so it became kind of clear to me that to be able to interpret these things correctly and understand what is going on, you need some kind of theoretical framework to kind of place these experiences in, to actually to have a coherent whole of what's going on. Otherwise it becomes really random. You don't really know, because there's so many meditation experiences that come on so many different levels. You need some system to kind of place these things in, to kind of make sense of this whole system, how this would work. And so that's kind of where I feel that, that's what Buddhism has. Buddhism has a theoretical framework. And it's, so this is kind of maybe the one thing that we can supply is a particular way of categorizing all these meditation experiences, so that you actually have something to hold on to as you go through this. There's no reason why you should use the Buddhist system. I mean, you could use Advaita Vedanta system, or you can use whatever really, or some psychologist or whatever. And but at least this is a system that has 2,500 years of experience, of meditation experience, and which I think has been proven many times over to have that sense of coherence. So that is kind of where I tend to come from, and where I, that's the only thing that I can imagine that maybe we can supply, in terms of this, your research is some kind of theoretical framework through which to see this. Because it did occur to me when I was watching that our theoretical framework is a bit different from how you see some of these things, and maybe that would be helpful.
For sure, and I think it's guaranteed to be different. The challenge we have as scientists trying to research meditation is that there's many traditions of meditation. Even within the narrower, perhaps even more well-defined path of Theravada Buddhism, there's a lot of variability. Right, and then not to include Mahayana and Vajrayana, and then, as you said, we could go much further into Hindu traditions and Western traditions and so on. So we're in a situation where we have to basically try to come up with a scientific model, which requires us to find the most parsimonious bits out of every tradition. And this means that we disappoint everybody, and we almost certainly get it wrong, right? And there is no... In the scientific frame, there is no right, there's just less wrong, right? And we try to get less wrong based on then the data that we accumulate and so on. Now, my own feeling is that we should be learning as much as we possibly can from these existing models. The challenge is that they're not mechanistic in nature. They don't refer to things that are going on in the brain, for instance, or things that are going on in the physiology of the body. And so when our frameworks and our theories are based on that, and so we have to make certain kind of adjustments to try to see where it fits or where it doesn't fit. And there's a lot of room for error. But I think a useful discussion is to, first of all, have these discussions, and second of all, to hear from someone like yourself who has such a refined understanding of this particular path of meditation, how it goes and what we might be overlooking as scientists, and what are some of the things that we should pay more attention to improve our models as they iterate towards less wrongness.
Okay. Please just speak whenever you want to say something, otherwise I might monopolize that.
No, yeah, I just don't want to sit here to be beautiful. I have something actually, because you, Ajahn, you said you watched one of these videos and you noticed the differences. I watched one of the videos and I noticed many similarities. Oh yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. I might phrase it differently, but I can see how the things you're saying line up with the early texts, which we've been sort of asked to talk about, but also with experiences. As monks, we can only say so much about our own experiences, as you might know, in the company of lay people. So I won't say too much about that, but when you said earlier that the mind doesn't directly know the outside world, right? It's like the senses know the world, then the mind only knows the electrical signals, you called it. Putting aside for a moment that there might be a difference between the brain and the mind, which we can maybe talk about later. It reminded me of an interesting little passage in the...
I wish this fly would get out of my predictive model.
It's just the external senses.
It's not real.
So that's the downside of sitting
Sorry
outside.
to interrupt you. It did go away now, so I got the message.
Now, there's an interesting passage in the early text, and Ajahn Brahmali, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Buddha says something like, the senses know the sensory experience, and the mind knows it afterwards, in a sense. And the mind only knows, how does it go again exactly, Ajahn Brahmali?
Well, I think the basically go is that the mind takes all the senses as its object.
Yeah, right.
And so,
Yeah, like the senses have their own domains or something, it's called. Yeah. And then the mind interprets that domain afterwards. And in meditation experiences, people can see also that thing happening, I think. Like you see, if you said if your mind starts slowing down, you got into the present moment, then the constructing, as you call it, gets less and less, which I definitely agree on. But you can also see more clearly what constructing there still is.
Indeed.
Right. And so I would say that you can even see, like, you hear a sound, and then the mind knows I heard a sound. You can, like, I don't like the word moments, but it's like almost, it is like moments, basically. You can see the different sensory things are really different from the mind. And then also the sense of self arising like afterwards. So that's like, you can see that constructing happening, and when you see that, it's like, who am I in this, you know? But that might be getting a bit deeper already. But that just to summarize, I see a lot of similarities between what you were saying and my understanding of the meditation and the text. What would you think, Ajahn Brahmali?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly one of those things, is that the deconstruction of consciousness, that consciousness is actually not one thing. Consciousness,
right.
The Dhamma is like many different things, and each sense has its own kind of consciousness. And for that reason, when you when you see that, what you're seeing is you see that there is no continuity there. And when there's no continuity, there is obviously no self. There's nothing that holds this together. It's just separate things that kind of go their separate ways. Yeah.
And this of course coincides very much again with the predictive processing view, or just basic neuroscience, which is that there's in the early stages of processing, as the world model is being built, you have what we might call segregated processing. So you have all of these little, this is not exactly right, but kind of like modules that are doing specialized things, like taking on the auditory data, taking the visual data, taking the olfactory data, interoceptive data, and so on. And these are initially all separate. But then at different what's called integration hubs in the processing hierarchy, they get pulled together. And then more things get pulled together, and more things get pulled together. And so you've got this hierarchy of basically like pulling together things that are separate. And part of, I think, indeed what you see in meditation is you come closer to the data. So you can see, first of all, you can still it, but you can also then see more clearly how it moves and how it's constructed. But the other thing is, as we might think in terms of 5 aggregates, is that we see that they separate actually in some way. And there's a lot to be discovered perhaps there. And this separation process is, again, I think maps on well to this way the predictive processing hierarchy works.
Yeah. Okay, but come back to the theoretical framework, because I wanted to kind of make a case for why a certain theoretical framework may be more powerful than other ones. And so what we deal with here is mostly what we call early Buddhism. And early Buddhism is a fairly kind of coherent set of texts that have a certain language, a certain vocabulary, a certain way, which obviously belong to roughly the same period. You will know that when you read this text because of the language. I often make sometimes people say we don't know anything about these texts and when they come from, which I think is completely wrong. It's not really true at all. It's a bit like, when you read the commentaries, you read the Abhidhamma or you read the Visuddhimagga and you compare it to the early texts, you realize that actually the language is different. It's a bit like reading Dickens compared to Shakespeare. You know that Dickens and Shakespeare did not write at the same time. The language is different. And if you ask anyone, everyone will know what was early and what was later. It's just bleeding obvious. It's just that because this is Pali language, I guess people are not as familiar with the language. They're more afraid of making those kind of assertions about what's going on, as compared to what they would do with English. And so we have a coherent body of text that has the same language, that presents things in what I think is a fairly coherent way, the idea of what the Dhamma Buddhism actually is. And that is very, very helpful, because once you have that, then you realize that if you take into account the broader Buddhist tradition, you get many ideas that contradict the early Buddhist texts. You have, first of all, you have the commentaries, and the Abhidhamma tradition. Then you have all the various practitioners around the world, the contemporary teachers. And if you take all of that into account, you're going to get very confused. So you need to focus on one particular theoretical framework to be able to have a clear and stable idea what happens in meditation. And that's why these early Buddhist texts are very powerful. The other advantage we use in the early Buddhist text is that it is the one thing that all Buddhist traditions really have in common here. Apart from that, they kind of go all the separate ways, but this is the one thing here. And it's kind of interesting, some of the great Mahayana teachers, like a monk called Master Yin Shun in Taiwan, Mahayana teacher, also agree that these are the early Buddhist texts. And so those people in the know, they understand the kind of evolution of these things and they know what's going on there. And so that is why we prefer that framework, because it comes closest to the time of the Buddha. I would argue this is the word of the Buddha. And because we have to assume the Buddha was enlightened. If the Buddha was enlightened, we have a big problem in the Dhamma in Buddhism. So that's kind of our base assumption, right? So if he gave this text, okay, so this is then the closest you probably get to ideas of awakening and the path that actually we hope are then correct as a concept. We don't know that until we realize it, but we hope they are. If they turn to be wrong, we have a problem. And so this is kind of the foundation we use. And then we interpret our experience in terms of that theoretical framework. That does not mean that there are no problems with understanding those early texts. There still are kind of serious problems of interpretation. What does this mean? And these are arguments that I had online and had all the time. But at least it narrows it down to a fairly manageable kind of area rather than being really, really spread out. And so when I say, I agree with Sunyo that there was a lot of things I could really appreciate in what you were saying. I could see a lot of commonalities. But this, when I say that there are certain differences, that is what I'm referring to. Those particular texts, that particular interpretation, that I would argue is the is the one that is the generally accepted interpretation of these texts, and that's kind of where we're coming from. So that is kind of was my making a case for a particular framework, a theoretical framework.
And I hear that, and I think I think the scientific community in meditation research has not paid enough attention to the sutta models, honestly, and that's kind of an accident of history. For example, the fact that a lot of the mainstream meditation research has been, in a way, it's not the right word, but sanctioned by the Dalai Lama, and so there's a lot of Tibetan influence, I would say, in there. And less conversation with classical Buddhists or Theravadans. So I think there could be much more of that. The challenge nevertheless is that for a scientific model, we can't simply take that and reinstantiate it and say that's now the scientific model.
Sure.
You see.
Sure.
So it all has to come out from the data, and it has to come out within our best understanding of how this organism works. So you might be able to have a difference, for example, between a didactic model, which we can think of the Pali Canon as a model for teaching, a practical model of how the experiences unfold and point to the next experiences and how to continue along the path and what to pay attention to and what not pay attention to. That's quite different from a scientific model, which is trying to explain the emergent phenomenology from what we could still call causes and conditions, but causes and conditions that are based in biology, in physics, and cognition, for instance. So all I'm just preparing you for disappointment,
sure.
because it's always going to.
I know that this is going to. I knew this was going to be. Obviously, it's going to be different. I understand that, and my point is more like to open up a different window to possibilities and to what meditation may be, rather than actually saying that you should follow a certain model. I don't expect you to do that at all. I would be very surprised if you did, to be honest. But at least open up the possibility, because you have to at least know that there is an alternative way of looking at meditation to be able to even take it into account.
So tell me, what is this alternative way? What is the way to see meditation that we are maybe missing?
Well, what I would say is that I think people don't appreciate the depth of samadhi as it is explained in early Buddhist texts. When we talk about jhanas, we're talking about extremely profound experiences. And this comes out very clearly when you look at the kind of broad way that the Buddha describes these states. He talks about them as the footstep of the Tathagata, the Buddha's footsteps. He talks about them as the happiness of awakening. He talks about them, the 4 stages of awakening, and the jhanas are always conjoined into one group. These are kind of this is the fruits of the spiritual life, according to the Samannapala Sutta and the long discourse of the Buddha. These are the fruits. And so they are very closely conjoined with awakening. And that's why they are at the end of the Noble Eightfold Path, right? It's kind of weird when you look at the Noble Eightfold Path. It ends with the jhanas. It doesn't end with wisdom or with awakening, anything like that. That is just the natural outcome of the jhanas. And so they are very, very, very profound. I think that is often underestimated. And so often the kind of arguments that Venerable Sunyo and I have, I mean, we're both disciples of Ajahn Brahm, and Ajahn Brahm to me has always been the person who describes the most profound level of samadhi, that as what the jhanas are as experiences. And so that is kind of one of the things we argue about all the time. How deep are they? We argue that these are basically the deepest experience you can have as a human being. The deeper the explanation of jhana, the more likely it is to be correct. Why? Because they basically are at the very end of the path. And so that's kind of one argument. The second argument is, well, when you have these very profound experiences of samadhi, which are full of happiness and joy and stillness, the ego seems to be gone, and all of these kind of things. Well, what are they if they're not the jhanas? Yeah, I mean, they don't fit into the kind of, they are left out of the description in the sutras if that is not jhana. If jhana is a place where you still have a bit of discursive thinking, you count the jhana factors, vitaka, vichara, piti, sukha, and ekaggata. Oh yeah, I got a bit of vitaka, vichara, I got a bit of piti, sukha, okay, must be the first jhana. Actually, it's not as simple as that. In fact, the 5 jhana factors is not the standard way that the jhanas are described in the sutras. They're described in very different ways. And so when we come to the jhanas, they are really, really profound, and they are states of complete solidity, especially the 2nd jhana onwards, where there is no movement, there's complete unity. This is, I think, what Advaita Vedanta talks about when they talk about their samadhi. Advaita, non-duality, right? It's called ekatta in the sutras, oneness. It's called ekodibhava. Ekodibhava means like become one. It means unification. Subject and object no longer exist. There's one experience. And so that is, and then they can last for a very long time. A jhana experience could last for 10 hours, if it is a profound jhana experience. So they are really, really deep experiences. And so that once you have that foundation, then kind of the whole sequence of jhanas going through the immaterial states and all the way to cessation become much easier to understand, because you have a starting point with the first jhanas or the 2nd jhana, and then the rest kind of comes out of that. So that's kind of how we see things here. I mean, it's quite, it is controversial, but to me it's not really controversial. To me, it's the only way that makes any sense, to be honest with you.
And it makes a lot of sense to me as well. In fact, for me, the jhana wars or the jhana debate is just that. It's just a debate. And there's folks trying to map out light jhanas versus deep jhanas, and this in some of the scientific papers would be called the deep jhana space, where you're talking about. And I personally, and just speaking for myself now, resonate much more with this because I read recently some of Ajahn Brahm's book, The Art of Disappearing, and he talks about the importance of the will and the absence of the will, which I think is exactly right. I think one of the ways or characteristics of jhana, as I hold it in my mind, is this total absence of intentionality, which is also the absence of the subject-object duality, which, just as you say, now you're in the territory of Sat Chit Ananda, truth, consciousness, bliss. So I think that union I fully resonate with. And when I look at the light jhanas, then you lose, there's no description of Satchitananda. There's no description of the pure non-dual awareness that can be completely still for exceptionally long periods of time. And that needed explanation.
It does.
And to be honest, the first time I saw that well described was in Ajahn Brahm's book. And so now I felt, okay, now I can put those experiences in the jhana bucket as opposed to the other journey. So
Yeah, I should say, Ajahn, there is always problems with textual interpretations. Like we say the jhanas are like this, but other people are just as convinced that the Buddha taught something else. And they may still have those Satchit Ananda kind of experience as well, but just place it a bit further down the path, maybe with the formless Arupa states or something. Exactly. So to just have the text as your primary guide for me has always been... has some problems, because you can always interpret them in multiple ways. So actually, when I first got into Buddhism, I was really kind of inspired by a quote by the Dalai Lama when he said, if science ever proves Buddhism wrong, then we should throw out those parts of Buddhism. Do you know that?
I do know that, and I respect that a lot, because I think underlying Buddhism and science is an authentic pursuit of truth.
Yes, exactly.
And I think that's what it's about, and that doesn't mean throwing out the existing models and the lessons that are there. We can venerate them and respect them, but we're here for truth,
of course.
Right.
You see, and dharmas are empty, right? And science is empty.
So what I'm interested in, at least in the space of this discussion, is not to say, oh, the textual model goes first or the science model goes first, but if they can help each other out to pointing to truth. And of course, in the end, our experience tells us what is really true. But in terms of relating that experience to others, I think this discussion can be very helpful.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree. I think one of the obvious things is that if science points to a different truth than the Dhamma or whatever, then there's a problem. Yeah, there's something needs to be resolved. You cannot just hold on to grasp.
Then science is wrong, basically.
Then science is wrong. Yeah, and this becomes very important in areas like the idea of rebirth, for example. Yeah?
Right.
Because that is obviously a Buddhist, something we take to be true in Buddhism.
Yeah.
And science is more skeptical. Science doesn't really have an opinion about rebirth because science doesn't really understand the mind. I mean, this is, as you had that paper, I had a quick look at the paper about active inference that you wrote with, what's his name? You just mentioned his name, Carl Friston
and Shamil Chandaria.
Yeah. And
a beautiful loop.
Beautiful loop, right? Okay, yeah. And as you say there in that paper, that consciousness isn't really understood. That's kind of what you start out with. It's kind of very uncertain. And if consciousness isn't understood, well, then the idea of rebirth is kind of impossible to even grapple with, from that point of view. So, but I would say that if it is possible to somehow disprove rebirth through scientific means, of course, then you have to accept that, and then you have to, unless you have an even more powerful experience yourself that you think that that there is rebirth, then of course you can't step away from that. So absolutely, and I agree with that. But but again, the idea here is that you need to, the early texts are important in the sense that when you have a samadhi experience, or you have these deep experiences, there should be some commonality between the text and that experience. Sure, that experience then allows you to interpret those texts, of course, and reading the text allows you to understand your experience. These two are mutually kind of go together. So both are important in a sense, and without both, you are kind of on very, very loose grounds. And so you need these things to come together. And what they do when they come together is that they open up a possibility of seeing meditation and seeing the world in a certain way that allow you to think about kind of the whole meditation space. And I think that's just like you were,
So this is, I think, where it gets kind of interesting for me also as a practitioner is the actual world model or ontology that we have about reality as a consequence of either practice or science or the texts or all of them together. I live in this kind of liminal space of like, I'll be for a few months embedded in practice and the text and so on. Then I'll be for another longer period in science and then a period in practice as well, right? And trying to come up with a way of understanding reality that is as true to that kind of confusing bunch of things is very difficult. And I wonder, so one question I have for you is it possible, do you think the Buddhist texts provide a way of understanding reality, or are they primarily a teaching tool? That's one. The second part is, even if you do take them to be a teaching tool, no, let's start with this first question, then we'll come back to the teaching. So either can you build a model of reality and how the world works and how we work, or is it primarily a teaching tool in your view?
It is primarily a teaching tool, because the purpose of the Buddha is very pragmatic. It's about overcoming suffering. However, as part of that teaching tool, there is certain things about reality that you need to know to be able to apply that teaching tool in a good way. And so part of that reality description would be things like rebirth. And it would be about maybe how consciousness is divided into separate streams, so that you can actually deconstruct consciousness and you can see the separate streams. It's not a coherent whole or a self. And so there will be a degree to which, but that's not the purpose of the Buddha. It's only describes reality to the extent that is helpful for the practice. One of the things I listened to, one of the things you said in one of your talks there was about whether the Dhamma, or whether the purpose is, in Buddhism, is to overcome suffering or to discover truth. Yeah, it was one of the things that was discussed there. And I would say they're not separate; they go together. Because you need to be able to make good choices, to be able to decide what you should be doing and not doing, you have to know reality. This is why in Buddhism we have this idea of yata bhuta jnana dasana, knowledge and vision according to reality. Only when you see things rightly will the mind make the right choices about what to pursue and what not to pursue. So seeing things according to reality in Buddhism means seeing the five khandhas as they actually are. When you see them as suffering, well, then you will reject them. If you didn't see them as suffering, you wouldn't reject them. So that is seeing things according. So truth and seeing truth and overcoming suffering are two sides of the same coin. They're not really separable. And so right view is kind of the critical element that allows you to abandon things. So I would say that the Buddha does describe reality to some extent, but not fully. Very often that description of reality then comes in later texts. That's why we have the Abhidhamma. Abhidhamma is trying to kind of describe reality. The early Buddhists would have said, okay, the Buddha didn't give a complete or coherent view of the world. We need a philosophical framework. We need to have kind of everything sorted out. But I think they lost their way a little bit, because that's not the point of Buddhism. Buddhism is a path, it's a psychology, it's kind of creating meaning in your life, and allowing yourself to find the highest meaning. That's the point. The point is not to create a philosophical framework for how to understand the world. That's kind of irrelevant. If there is a philosophical framework, it is just your experience of reality. That is the important framework, if you wish.
No, it makes a lot of sense. And then my question is, and it's a little bit to Dalai Lama's quote, could it be that one day science offers a more pragmatic path?
One of the things with what is pragmatic is everybody's different, right? So what is pragmatic to one person might not be pragmatic to another. Even the Buddha talked about having followers who more follow him on faith, others who follow him more on his teachings, on maybe the technicalities of the teachings. So what I think is that science can have a part in being helpful, at least for a certain subset of practitioners. Maybe others find it somewhat inspiring, like me. Others reject it completely, but there will be, I think, a part to it.
And to be clear, we're really far away from
from
that.
But this is what I was also thinking when Ajahn Brahmali was like saying, the Buddha doesn't give a complete picture, and then the Abhidhamma tried to, and we don't really follow the Abhidhamma here, at least not the later parts where it really gets, in my view, too technical. But one of the things is, even through direct insight, I think there's certain things you just can never completely reach, like how is the brain connected to consciousness in detail, for example, because you cannot really with your own mind look into the mechanics of your brain, if it's even the mind is there, which I'm not even sure about that, So
maybe we should talk about consciousness a little bit. I think.
I was going to add a little bit to what Sunyo was saying, because this idea of whether science can add to the path and kind of make the path more, kind of go faster or whatever, or become. And I think I basically agree with what you said, Sunyo. But the idea of the path is a very simple idea. The path is about basically purifying the mind, getting rid of the defilements of the mind. Because as long as those defilements are there, the mind is not pure enough to be able to see things according to reality. The defilements are what distort your ability to see things clearly. I mean, obviously, we can all agree that desire and ill will, they distort how you see things. And so I think that general outline of the path is kind of fixed pretty much. You have to move towards a pure mind state, which allows you kind of insight. Now, those little details, however, how you reach that kind of purity of mind, they are not, they can obviously be added to that. And the Buddha doesn't necessarily give all the details of how that is to be done. Very often the teaching is like a kind of a broad outline of the path, where the details have to be worked out. The Buddha says, overcome ill will. Okay, so how do you actually do that? Well, there isn't there is a little bit of description of that in the sutras, but not that much. And often you have to kind of apply your own mind in the right way to do that. And I think in such details, psychology and psychiatry or science or neuroscience or whatever can probably add something in those details. But I think the overall is pretty much, I don't know if there is any kind of alternative path up the mountain, if you know what I mean. There's like one path, one general path, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what comes to mind? You want to say something?
Well, before we veer off to other topics, I thought it would be a good opportunity, as you were describing the framework and the jhanas, to explore what the early Buddhist texts say about Nirodha Samapatti, because that term is used from the Buddhist text and published. You know, the research that you published on someone getting into Nirodha Samapatti. So that is a Buddhist term. So maybe that would be a good opportunity to define what the early Buddhist texts say about Nirodha.
It also gets us into the consciousness discussion.
Yeah.
Exactly. Maybe we can
Increased heart rate, because in the report it was unexpected to have an increased heart rate under that state. So, and what the early Buddhist texts would predict how the physiology would say. So before we go away from this topic, this is a good opportunity to get into that, perhaps, and the touching, the cessation, totally, like it's a touching of it rather than experiencing it.
So maybe first consciousness and then non-consciousness.
Sure, you lead the way, Ruben. How do you want to take it?
Well, I mean, first I just want to say why I got interested in cessation, or why I thought it was a good scientific target. As usual with these things, it's mainly serendipity, just meeting the right people who happen to have the connections to someone who claimed to be able to do these things. But also because when you're talking about, for example, jhanas or other contemplative states, they can be very up for interpretation, right? And there's many kind of ways of seeing, degrees of depth, all the kind of things we already touched on. But from a scientific lens, the idea of an internally generated state of cessation of all experience and everything, right? Including the perception of time having passed, so distinguishing it from sleep and so on. It sounds much more like general anesthesia or something like that than it does a nap, for example. Is a great scientific target because it teaches us something about the nature of consciousness. First of all, we didn't know as a scientific community that you can, from within, turn off consciousness, right? So that's already a mystery, right? How you can come out of such a state in a controlled way, that's also a mystery. So all along this, you can learn about the nature of consciousness while also from the outside, of course, probing the physiology and what's going on in the brain in these states, because we just simply didn't know. We had an idea of what the sutras say about what we should expect, and that's why we were really scared when we were looking at the brain scans and the heart rate and everything when this was meant to be occurring. Of course, we in the end didn't find that the brain turned off or that the heart rate completely, tanked or something like that. We did not find that, but we did find interesting things. Like we found, for example, compared to a kind of short sleep or more like a nap state, the brain shut down further across the different EEG spectral frequencies. So this suggests, for example, that it might be a bit deeper kind of shutdown in the system. But paradoxically, we also found that the heart rate was slightly higher. Other thing we found that was very interesting during a 90-minute period is that all of these were exceptionally stable, and that the meditator was able to basically time it to 90 minutes almost precisely without any prompting. So we saw the heart rate, the respiration, the body movement, and the neural activity be extremely stable for 90 minutes. And then basically exactly at the 90 minutes, we saw the eye movements come back online. And we saw kind of the basic physiology come back. So interesting findings, not as extreme as you might maybe expect based on the early suttas, and always with the complete humility that we don't know if this is a legitimate Nirodha Samapatti. And now actually we have multiple subjects in these experiments across our lab, but also Matthew Sackett's lab in Harvard has had now multiple studies on both Nirodha and Nirodha Samapatti, with different findings that I could also go into. But that's sort of the big picture.
Just as to make a little note here, you said Nirodha and Nirodha Samapatti.
Right.
For the people who don't know, I watched your talk and you make a distinction there. I don't think the early texts exactly make that exact distinction.
No, they don't. Yeah.
Although I do think it's kind of implied, but there's also like what you call Nirodha is like maybe shorter cessation experiences, to use the word experience, or maybe ones that are not preceded by the jhanas, or whereas Nirodha Samapatti, at least in the suttas, is always preceded by the jhanas. So I think people have those cessation events as well, but the suttas are not super, don't say too much about it, but just to make that distinction clear for people who are listening. But you say on the basis of the suttas we might expect like that your brain completely stops or whatever and your heart rate slows down. It's kind of interesting that the Nirodha is described as your faculties become bright, or how does the standard translation? Faculties become
when you come out
clear. That's how it's interpreted in the commentaries. But I have another interpretation of that. Is that when other people look at your body while you're in Nirodha, it still looks very alive. I've actually written a bit about that. I can send it to you afterwards. Might be interested in that. So actually, based on the suttas, you would expect that the body still, in my reading of the suttas, the body does still look very alive, but it's just from the inside. There is no consciousness there. And so, just one final thing. If you read the suttas quite widely, then the experience or experience of Nirodha is placed on equal level almost as nirvana. Nirvana. It's like the Buddha calls it the highest comfort, and at one place he also says, let go of the state of boundless consciousness to attain the neither perception or non-perception. You're familiar with that? And let go of neither perception or non-perception to attain nibbana. So that to me that's very interesting, because it tells us something about the nature of nibbana, or parinibbana as well. Sorry for the technical words for people. I see you're following it, but other people might.
Does he ever call? Actually, in the suttas, it's not called Nirodha. It's called Sanya Vedaita Nirodha. That's kind of the standard expression in the suttas. But in the commentaries, they call it Nirodha Samapatti.
Once in the suttas as well, actually.
Is it?
Yeah, it is.
Okay. Well, you know more than I do about one. Does it ever call it Ditteva Dhamma Nibbana Nirodha? Nibbana is Nibbana here and now.
Like he says, no, he calls it like, in one of the suttas in the Anguttara Nikaya, it says it's like Nibbana visible in this life or something.
Right.
Like that, And also he calls it, all the preceding states he calls qualified cessation.
Right.
And then
Pariyayena.
And then the Nirodha Samapatti, or cessation of perception and feeling.
Yeah.
He calls it cessation in an unqualified sense. So it implies that there's nothing more that, from your personal perspective, that could cease.
I think one of the problems, I understand what you're saying, that Nirodha is a more kind of easily graspable concept from a scientific point of view, because it kind of, if things stop or they're not stopped, it's kind of, it's more kind of clear one. But actually I don't think it's as clear cut as you might think. I think that's the problem because things can cease in different ways. You mentioned anesthesia. You get anesthetized, you go to deep sleep at night, and it feels like things have ceased completely, but obviously it is not Nirodha Samapatti or Sanya Vedaita Nirodha. It's different. We have something in the suttas called the asanya satta, the beings without perception. And that is also a kind of nirodha, because the mind stops. But it's not nirodha samapatti, because when you come out afterwards, you continue the cycle of existence. Then you have in the Mahasi tradition, you have this idea of, and I think that's what you're referring to when you talk about nirodha, is this kind of Mahasi tradition. You become a stream enterer, and everything blanks out, and you come back afterwards. Okay, now you're a stream enterer because things blanked out. And so there are many different ways in which things can cease, but only one of them is Sanyavadaita Nirodha, and that is the movement through all the jhanas to the material realm, and then everything stops. And then together with that insight that happens at that time, then you enter Sanyavadaita Nirodha. And so it is not as simple as just having the ending of things. That's what kind of makes it actually not as obvious as it may seem. And so the way that this is described in the sutras, and this is maybe where I don't fully agree with Venerable Sunyo, is that, for example, in the sutras, when you come to the fourth jhana, the breath is supposed to stop. Yeah, that's what it says. It says kaya sankara nirodha, or something like kaya sankara is the breath, how it's defined. And some people say it means the perception of breath, but the perception of breath has disappeared long time ago.
I actually agree with that as well. Well, with your perspective, just for the record.
Yeah, okay, good, yeah. So actually in the fourth jhana, already you shouldn't be able to observe any breath anymore. And nirodha obviously is much more profound than that. And so you actually go into something much deeper. And I would say the only way that the breath can stop is because there's no more metabolism going on there. As long as the metabolism is going, oxygen is required, right? That's how metabolism works. So you have to breathe to keep it going. And so I would say you've come to such a point where everything has been so peaceful that the metabolism itself stops, which means also implies no heart rate, which implies basically nothing going on, right?
Yes, but my question would be, put on a little bit my scientist hat and say, how would they know? So from the inside, they would not perceive it. From the outside, they might not perceive it. But if we had the right instruments that are sensitive enough, they probably are still going on. So if you think, for example, of, and I've made this comparison before, it might be very blasphemous, but that Nirodha Samapatti is something. It's funny because, monks like to go to caves to practice and whatever, but our ancestors were actually hibernators, if you go far back enough in the evolutionary tree. And so there is this capacity to really slow down the metabolism, but this takes a lot of time. That's why also in the lab you would never expect a sudden decrease in these things. It would be homeostatically too shocking to the system. It would need days actually to really slow down, as it happens in hibernating animals. But it could be that these capacities are, remnants in some way of our history as hibernators, and being able to leverage this capacity for the purposes of awakening. Maybe that is why when you go into a state like Nirodha Samapatti, the breath is so subtle from both outside and inside perception. It stopped. The heartbeat is so subtle that both inside and outside the perception is stopped. But that's because you don't have the right instrument, perhaps. I don't know. All I can say is, like, from a scientific perspective, we've never seen an organism go into a state where both heart and respiration that I'm aware of, there could be exceptions to this, there's often exceptions, has completely stopped, certainly in a human, for an extended period of time and then not being dead.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective, actually.
The hibernation perspective is interesting.
That's more fun.
But I think with these kind of extreme states like the cessation of perception and feeling, you would expect something completely different from what you have ever observed before. I think that's kind of the point. These are really, really unusual. How many people in the world are even able to achieve the fourth jhana, let alone Nirodha? And I don't know if there's anyone in the whole world who can achieve these states, to be honest with you. Maybe there's some sage somewhere in the Himalaya mountains kind of hidden away from the rest of the world. But these are extremely rare events, And so I think we should expect to see things that we have never observed before. That's what we should actually expect, in my opinion. And so you just have to find that person who can do it, to measure them and see.
And that might be it. It might be that there is, that we are seeing some sort of light versions of Nirodha Samapatti and so on. Of course, the descriptions of these meditators is very clear that it is going through the jhanas all the way to and practicing the intentional staying. And this meditator also claims to be able to do it for up to a week. Right. But who knows, right? We have to take it with a grain of salt. Yeah. Always as scientists, I personally feel a reasonable degree of trust towards some of the participants, but we don't know. That's the bottom line. Yeah. And the thing that I remain open-minded about is that while our instruments are sensitive in some ways, they're also exceptionally insensitive in other ways. So there can be really radical things happening in the mind, brain, and consciousness that we simply can't detect with the way that we're measuring them, right? So just to give you a kind of one example. So like one thing that happens when folks are going into Nirodha is a desynchronization of neural activity. Yeah. This is really important because the brain relies on synchronized activity in order to give us a coherent experience, which is, as we know, kind of an illusion of coherence. But what you see as you go into Nirodha, you get this sharp breakdown in the coherence of the neural activity. So the waves of activity are no longer aligning with each other, suggesting that the information integration has been separated, right? This kind of aligns with the idea of if you, for example, separate the 5 aggregates and you see them for what they are, and then there's the release, right? So that might be, to the conscious mind, extremely radical thing to happen, right? Because our whole model of existence relies on the coherent integration of information. It might look a bit boring on a device because it's just that the waves are not lining up with each other as much. They're not correlating as much, right? So, and this is the thing we can capture that might be more meaningful than it seems, but there might be a whole host of things that we just don't know how to probe at. Again, we're probing things at such a coarse level. We're not probing things at the level of microtubules or at the level at which the brain might sustain quantum interactions. Quantum biology is a whole new field, right? So there's all of this thing that's just, ripe for investigation and discovery. And for me, it's kind of just exciting, the whole thing, right? But I also, I fully agree, and I've encouraged this with our scientists who are researching this, that we have to make sure that we expand our scope of participants when it comes to jhanas, when it comes to cessation, and the only way that science works is through replication and then hopefully convergent evidence over time across hopefully many traditions, across practitioners from different schools and so on, and then maybe we start to get some picture, but we have to start somewhere.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, this is maybe an area where science has, at least what you're doing, has some very practical implications as well. I must again place a little side note that I was very scientific as a layperson and masters of science and stuff, but then I had certain experiences in meditation and I was like, no, science will never be able to touch this, and I still feel that way. So I'm a bit on both sides. But anyway, when it comes to Nirodha, that is, I think it's still not completely touchable by science, but if you can show that such experiences are possible to some people, it has very practical implications on how we view the goal of Buddhism as well. And you talked about Satchitananda before, but if you realize that there is also a cessation, then I suppose you would agree with us that that kind of pure bliss consciousness is not a permanent thing. Would you?
I agree. Yeah. This has maybe been one of the contentious things that I've been bringing to Dharma science dialogues, is that people are often shocked when I make the claim, both from a practice angle but also from a scientific angle, that consciousness is not the ground.
Right. Well, we wouldn't be shocked by that at all.
I'm aware. I'm also here on day 4 of a retreat with you guys, so there's some resonance in our understanding of the path, if not complete resonance. But I think that's exactly right. So I think we need to keep in mind the big picture as well here, right? Because what science is doing, like that's already, if you think about it from the Buddhist side, a big service to the Buddhist teaching is to show that these states really, there are these states. It's possible to go this far.
Cessation.
Even if we're just describing them or we're beginning the journey of exploring them, right? This suddenly opens the mind to all sorts of practitioners of where it's possible to go in a spiritual path. And there are millions, if not billions of people on spiritual paths. And this might be suddenly quite surprising. We might not have the exact right practitioners, we might not have the right model, but at least we're beginning the exploration, right? And I think it does open doors in people's minds to new ways of seeing reality.
You know, I agree, and I think that is very, very helpful, because it's the problem with the Satchitananda thing is that it's very attractive.
Extremely.
And of course it is, but it's not attractive. It's both attractive. It's attractive, you know, as an experience, but also as an idea. It's kind of attractive in so many ways. Whereas cessation is much more difficult to get your head around why that is attractive. Even though ultimately it's even more attractive, it's very hard to understand why. And so for that reason, it's very important to kind of be able to, you know.
Why do you think it is attractive?
Satchitananda?
No.
Cessation?
Yes, over Satchitananda.
But the reason, the ultimate reason from a Buddhist point of view is this idea of rebirth. You carry on, you go, okay, yes, Satchitananda may lead to a kind of favorable rebirth in your next life, but then it lasts only so long. And once you get to that other end of it, you're back to square one again. And that is kind of the Buddhist idea. This ultimate, it doesn't have any, even though the state in itself, you know, arguably cessation is even better state, which I think it is. It is a superior state to Satchitananda in terms of just the ultimate peace and the ultimate giving up and whatever, the clarity of mind you have afterwards, all of these kind of things. But the difference isn't that great, because Satchitananda obviously is very beautiful already. But the real problem is because it doesn't actually last forever, as people claim. And that leads me to a very important theoretical consideration about the idea of eternal mind, which basically this is about. The idea that this is going to go on forever. Once you have unified with Brahman, then that's it. You will carry on. It's very easy to take that. You have a beautiful state of samadhi. It's very easy to think of it as something permanent because it is more real, more powerful, more unified, more blissful than anything you have ever experienced in your life by far. And so to see it as something, this must be the ground of all existence, the ground of consciousness, whatever, is a natural kind of inference to make. But actually, there is nothing in the data you have had to suggest that this is going to last forever. All it is an experience that arises and passes away. The moment you say this is permanent, this is going to be everlasting, you're adding interpretation to the raw data. And I think this is what happens in most spiritual traditions, because it is so incredibly attractive. It is very easy to make that leap, when in fact there is no real reason for making that leap. So there is a very important theoretical problem with this idea that this you have reached something solid, something permanent, something that will always be there. There isn't any data. No data in existence can give rise to that conclusion. It is an interpretation. It is a construct of the mind rather than a reality that you have seen. And so even from a theoretical perspective, I think this Satchitananda thing, or eternal mind, or whatever you want to call it, is problematic. And it is basically it's more like a theory than actually a realized reality.
So maybe the question is not so much what is attractive about cessation, but what is unattractive about everything else. It's more like your mind gets pushed away by things that it doesn't see ultimate satisfaction in, or that it eventually sees as impermanent. It's not like, oh, I really want to see it, that you don't really have that intention. Right? It's more like your mind just gets pushed away by everything else, or disillusionment or disenchantment is the term in the early Buddhist texts.
But I think it's helpful also to think of cessation as something beautiful as well, and to try to understand it from that point of view. It's a bit like a value judgment in a sense. Yeah, it's just, and it's very hard to get your mind around. But for that reason, it can do a bit of good PR, yeah, because it's so hard to really get your mind around it. And one of the really curious passages you find in the sutras is this passage where there's a monk called Eudaimonia and Venerable Sariputta. They argue about the idea of cessation, and Eudaimonia says, how can it possibly, when everything ends, how can that be a positive experience when there's nothing there? And Venerable Sariputta answers, well, that's precisely why it's such the highest happiness, because there's no experience. And so this is kind of the.
It is a hard sell.
It's a very hard sell, but this is why Satchidananda idea is actually inferior, because there's still something there, and that there-ness actually is inferior to the complete cessation.
Well, I'm curious what you think, because what I point to, and you know the sutta so much better, so I'd love to hear your thoughts. Isn't it a central part of the teaching is the cessation of suffering? It's a liberation from suffering, and it's freedom. So one thing that I see limiting of, for example, the Satchitananda view or pure awareness or so on, is because there remains suffering in the craving for those states. Because you want now to sustain those states, and they're impermanent, and so you can't sustain them, and you suffer the loop of wanting to maintain them. But what cessation offers is the discovery of the impermanence of everything, of the three characteristics of all the appearances. And the result of that is liberation within the appearances. It's freedom, you see. It's freedom within the interdependence of reality. So this is just a slightly different, because now the selling point is the resultant liberation as opposed to the vanishing itself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that resonates with me a lot. I suppose people who see some kind of consciousness as the ultimate goal, they will not say, oh, I'm craving for it all the time, as you say. They will just say, oh, you don't crave for it, and then you get it. But in my experience, it's easier to stop your craving if you realize, oh, there's, in a sense, nothing to get, right? I'm not going to get anything out of this practice. So, in a sense, you have to be careful with those things as well, because you might fall into the idea that of annihilation, like I am myself, I'm gonna be destroyed or whatever. That aside, if you can phrase it, or if you can put it in a framework of non-self, then it's very liberating to sit down and just meditate and know whatever I'm experiencing is gonna be impermanent. There's nothing there to sustain, and that in itself, is a very liberating experience already.
And the absence of clinging, right? I think that's also something that is easier to market in some way, right? Because the state of freedom is one where the mind is not grasping onto things and wanting things and then suffering their absence, suffering both the presence of things that we don't like and the absence of things that we do like. And that's a good thing, I think.
So what you're saying is obviously true, that if you have a state of cessation, then grasping is much easier it naturally kind of stops. Whereas if you have a state of great bliss, then grasping is much more, you tend to grasp it. And that is, I think, I agree with that. And in the end, if there is nothing there, nothing to it undermines the whole idea of craving. This is why craving can be completely ended, according to Buddhism, because there's nothing to crave for. There's nothing there that is really interesting, and you just the whole thing is just undermined being.
But you mentioned the word marketing. I don't think Buddhism should be like a marketer to the broadest audience, because I think there are people who will hear this idea of cessation, and it might be a minority, but they will be. Yeah, that makes sense to me. When I first read the Four Noble Truths, like long ago, I was in my teens, and I got this idea, like there's like rebirth forever, and then the goal is just to end it. That is brilliant. that is really like the Buddha is a genius. Who makes up such a thing? Unless they really thought it was true, you didn't make it up to get followers. But so many people were actually inspired by that idea as well, and I know many people in the world who feel alienated by certain branches of Buddhism, where they do go for this like blissful mind as the ultimate goal. So don't try and market your research for a wide audience. I'd say you just find out what's true, and then people will be naturally attracted.
It has to be it has to be put out there so people like you,
Yeah.
get inspired, can actually say, "Yay, look at this!" and ending a rebirth. If otherwise,
Look,
people don't
science
get
shows
it.
that I'm
Yeah,
right.
exactly. So you have to put these things out there. Oh dear.
If I may highlight something before I go to the highlight, I think for most scientists, the truth is more important than any marketing. As an ex-scientist, I was always in the pursuit of truth, no matter if I liked it or if I didn't, because that was more valuable. So I think that would appeal to those. But you briefly touched upon awakening, and this is something that would be beneficial to many scientists, because now there's a trend to study awakening, and there's different ways of understanding what does awakening mean, from different spiritual traditions. And you briefly touch upon it when that inference of, this is permanent, but then that inference that this too is subject to cessation, and the resulting of undermining that letting go of craving. So I was wondering if we can bring to light and just explore and clearly describe what awakening means in early Buddhist texts and the consequences of that, how it happens, and perhaps how scientists can, maybe some clues for scientists who may be listening to this, how they can study this in the brain, or maybe how it might look like, even though the experience is perhaps outside of conscious activity, because we're going here outside the realm of human mind. These deep states of meditation are outside the human mind, but the awakening experience, could you measure this aha moment in the brain? And then how would someone know that this is a true insight rather than a false insight? Because Ruben's PhD thesis was on manipulating and creating false insights. So
I would like to just that's great. I would just like to emphasize the importance of the question of awakening in science at the moment, just because it's very interesting. There's a foundation called the Consciousness Foundation, who's all about the science of awakening, and they've devoted over $1 million to basically fund scientific research on awakening. And so we're at the precipice of building some models of a thing. And there's many ways where we might draw information on how to build those models. And so you mentioned the importance of the suttas. So I think actually for listeners, this would be great to hear how awakening is framed in the classical teachings.
Yeah, there's different ways you can suppose approach that question. But I'm trying to find a way in that might align with science, with my limited knowledge of science and my slight skepticism on some areas as well. Because Ajahn Brahmali mentioned rebirth earlier, and when the awakening is described in the suttas, that is very often connected to insight directly into rebirth and its ending. That is like the core thing that stream winners have already insight into this, but the fully, okay, maybe I'm using technological terms again. It's like the first stage of awakening, people already have insight into this, but in full awakening, they basically know that they don't get reborn again. If there would be any standard way to phrase the insight of awakening, I would say that would be core insight. So how can you measure that with science? That would be very difficult. I'm actually very interested that one day maybe science can even find ways to investigate rebirth more directly than they are doing, like with past lives memories or something.
I think it's a really good point. I think one of the really critical Buddhist understandings of the world is this idea of rebirth, and without the idea of rebirth, Buddhism doesn't really make any sense. The whole purpose of Buddhism is to end rebirth. So without rebirth, by definition, doesn't make any sense anymore. And so I think that maybe instead of investigating awakening directly, which assumes a lot of other things, investigating something like rebirth actually is incredibly important.
So what do you mean by rebirth?
We mean like you die in this life and you can be reborn as another human being in the next life, or you can be reborn in a large variety of ways. Samsaric existence carries on until you become an arahant, basically. Yeah.
But would you say that in the meditation path there are some particular moments where the mind transforms dramatically?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I would point just where I'm coming from with the notion of awakening, and where I suspect the zeitgeist is going is toward pointing our kind of scientific instruments at these profound moments of sudden transformation that occur, where there's a clear nonlinearity between the past and the future mind.
Yeah.
Now, my hunch is that in the Theravada context, because we're not talking about full enlightenment here, we're talking about awakening, then we're probably talking about stream entry or stream winner. And so maybe we could put a target around that. And what is said in the early suttas about this event?
Stream entry is, maybe the easiest way to understand this is in terms of the dependent liberation sequence, which is a standard sequence in the suttas. And so you come from samadhi. Samadhi usually means jhanas. You come out of the jhanas, and then you have yata bhuta nanadasana, which basically means seeing the five khandhas in terms of the three characteristics. So you see the five khandhas as impermanent. That implies suffering and implies non-self. So you have the full understanding of your entire psychophysical organism as impermanent, as non-self, and as suffering. Because you see it all as suffering, you get nibbida. Nibbida is a rejection of the whole thing. Nibbida is often translated as disenchantment and this kind of thing, or disinterestedness, but actually it means a rejection of it, as a pushing away of all of that. Because you push it all away, because you don't have any interest anymore, you have viraga. Viraga means the ending of desire for all of that. And that ending of desire then leads to ultimate liberation down the track, or it is a liberation there already at that particular point. And so that is what it is. It is this insight into the full insight into suffering and non-self and impermanence is what that is. And that changes your mind completely, because before you were somehow attached to this five khandhas in some way at least. Afterwards, you have let go completely of that attachment. You don't have it anymore. It re-emerges again because you haven't uprooted all the things as a stream entry, but your view of the world is correct from that point on. And
And what does that look like from? Because in science we can study experience and we can study physiology, right? So again, pointing our target at this stream winner, stream entry. What's happening in the moment and the moment after in the experience that might have neurophysiological kind of correlates, for example?
Yeah, hard for us to say, at least for me, because I'm not a cognitive scientist or a mind scientist. But it's definitely a shift that there's various aspects to it, and maybe this is one that might be interesting. Is you mentioned the aspect of non-self with respect to the five aggregates. One that I think is very pronounced is a realization that you mentioned before, the will is without a self. So basically a realization that there is, to put it in modern philosophical terms, that there's no free will. And the stream winner also starts to, sometimes they forget it, but in general they start living up to that idea more and more. And it's more like you live life without a center. And I think in science they also know that there's no like central part in the brain. And you also see that when you're having a discussion like this, like words come out of the mouth, and then it's not like there is a center in experience that decides what you're going to say. For most people it feels like that, but for many not for many people it feels like that, but for stream winners it won't. I once had a discussion with Ajahn Brahmali, or actually a little interview, because I was really confused at the time from some meditation experience, and I went to Ajahn Brahmali and was talking with him, and he didn't really exactly see what was going on, and then he gave me this letter, just a letter that he had received from a lady who was thanking him for his teachings and so forth. And I thought, why is he giving me this letter? So Ajahn, I can't read it anymore. because before you have this experience that you are in here being the reader, going out, reading that thing, and then the text comes back to you, and then you think about it. But it was like almost completely the other way around. Like, yeah, living life without a center is how it feels like. I think I stole that from Sam Harris. He calls it like that. And maybe that is something where science can be illuminating as well.
So one kind of
Ruben, it's getting really, really late.
yeah.
I'd like to have a quick break before we
right.
have the Dhamma talk.
Yeah.
Is that all right? I mean, if you want to carry on with Sunyo, please do so. But I'd like to go up and say hello to Ajahn Brahm quickly before.
Sure.
Yeah, maybe we can close it very quickly then before.
Okay, we can close it maybe.
Some closing thoughts.
If you want to.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think there's so many more conversations to be had. For example, I would love to at some point share like how we might think about what you've just described in the way that, for example, a predictive model can reach a point where it has to change because it's accumulated too much new information, for example, from meditation. And when a model needs to change, you can imagine that being like a disillusionment phase because the model is seeing, I can't sustain this model of reality anymore. It doesn't work. It doesn't appear to be real in light of my practice. And so at some point there comes a kind of precipice where the system just can't sustain its wrong view in light of the exposure therapy of practice. And the prediction error forces a kind of software update. And this new software update is much more flexible, is much more open, and has a much different kind of understanding of the nature of the self and phenomena and so on. Anyway, so there's many things we can talk about.
Okay, cool. No, that's great. Yeah. Thank you, Ruben, for the discussion.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's actually been fascinating. And so thank you for coming to Perth and for visiting us and everything.
It's an honor to be here, and I really appreciate this time, and I hope for many more of these discussions.
We have a bhikkhuni who lives